So welcome viewers and listeners to another edition of CHP Talks. I'm here again with Kris Sims from Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And Kris, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give you a little introduction, but I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
And for those who may not know, Kris Sims has been a repeated guest on this show and a very welcome guest. She is the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. She formerly was in BC and did a great job there. She's a longtime journalist in Canada. She was one of the founding reporters for Sun News Network. She's worked in and around government for more than 20 years. And of course, as I mentioned, she's been a guest on the show several times. We're grateful for her spending time with us today. She and Franco Terrazzano and others from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation host their own podcast, which is well worth listening to. You should get it on your list of podcasts. And of course, their regular taxpayer magazine is top notch. Also, there's a wealth of information on their website, taxpayer.com. And I urge all of our listeners, if you're not already a receiver, a subscriber of Taxpayer Magazine, to become a subscriber and a contributor. They do great work, necessary work, informing Canadians about how our taxes are being used and misused, and as they are an advocacy group for more freedom through less government. And again, Kris, thanks so much for joining us today. And we're here to talk about a couple of things today, one of which is the recent Supreme Court decision to overturn or to rule unconstitutional sections of Bill C-69, sometimes known as the No More Pipelines Act, also officially known as the Environmental Impact Assessment Act. And it was, well, you can tell our audience about a bit of an attempt by the government to control resource development in the provinces. And thank God the Supreme Court has done something right here. They do not always get it right, but this time they did. And so tell us about that act and how it came about that it was overturned at the Supreme Court.
Yes, it was some very welcome and unfortunately rare good news. Premier Danielle Smith actually referred to it the other day, if I'm paraphrasing her, the "You're not allowed to build or develop anything anywhere" act. And what that was basically the federal government, the Trudeau government, saying, you cannot develop whatever it is within your provincial boundaries. So in the context of Alberta, for example, that could be a mine or a pipeline or a new oil field, something like that. And based on the wording of the legislation, government lawyers here in Alberta were arguing that even something as simple and innocuous as a gravel quarry could have been big-footed and not allowed because of the federal government's new rule. And so the Canadian Taxpayers Federation tagged in on this court fight for a couple of reasons. One, technically, if we're having to fight with two different levels and layers of government, the ability to hold that government accountable is greatly diminished. So as a taxpayers organization and an accountability grassroots organization, we said, you're muddying the waters here. We can't have all of these cooks in the kitchen. Further, if you are constantly shutting down resource development, such as pipelines, you are grossly inhibiting the ability for the government to collect something as simple as income taxes. So using the numbers just for federal income taxes, we're not talking about property taxes, provincial taxes, nothing. Because Canada did not have its proper and full pipeline capacity for the past 10 years, we've lost out on around $13 billion with a B. Again, that is simply the federal income tax portion that we are losing out because those workers, those men and women, are not out there putting in the pipelines, monitoring the pipelines, getting product to market, all of that stuff that, of course, they get busy with their work, thus generating income, thus generating income tax. So the Taxpayers Federation was what's called an intervener in this case, meaning we put money down through our supporters. Thank you very much. We paid for a lawyer to be right on the floor of the Supreme Court in their full robes. And thankfully, this decision went our way, and it went Canadians' way, because this time it wasn't just Alberta as the lone voice. Other provinces were tagging in too, because by the letter of this law, Ontario could have been prevented from putting in a nuclear plant or a new mining town up near Thunder Bay, or technically Quebec could have been prevented from putting in a new hydroelectric dam. If the Maritimes, for example, decided to actually use the natural gas that they're sitting on and develop that resource, that could have been big-footed as well. And so it was really good to see other provinces tagging in this time to help Alberta out, and it definitely went our way. So this is an enormous win for Canadian provinces, for provincial jurisdiction, and for taxpayers.
Tremendous. And thanks to you, your organization, for having a lawyer on the case. Seems like all of us who care about the future of this country seem to be in court more often than we ever anticipated before. We're about entering into another court scene with the Hamilton City Council over freedom of expression, and we can touch on that later. I understood, I overheard, or I listened to your podcast with Andrew Lawton the other day, and the two of you brought out that the federal government was trying to take this as a win. They lost it in court, and yet they're trying to spin it and that they learned something from the courts, and they're going to go back and try to rewrite or reword this legislation. What do you see likely to happen there? Are they going to pull something off, or are they going to actually have to retreat into the corner and sulk for a while?
So slightly taking off my taxpayer's hat, I'm putting my old reporter hat back on. So I worked on Parliament Hill for about 20 years, including covering Supreme Court decisions for various news outlets. My hunch is this. One, the language initially in the federal government's response was what one would expect. Thank you very much, sir. May I please have another? We've got guidance, that sort of thing, is usually what you would refer to as the proper and respectful climb down language coming from the state, coming from the government. However, there were also some words in there that, as a reporter, would have sparked my interest, and as a taxpayer's representative, causes me concern. And that is something to the effect of, we are going to quickly go back to the House of Commons and rework this and rewrite this. Instead of saying, you know what, you're right, we crossed a line, we're backing off, let's move on to whatever it is they're doing, a grocery tax or something. They said no, that they're going to go back to the drawing board quickly and redo this. So to me, that sounds like not taking no for an answer. And so this is where it gets concerning, because if you just read the judgment, it's pretty clear. It's telling the federal government to stay in its lane outside of very rare exceptional circumstances, such as, federal crown land, some things like that. Generally speaking, the federal government was told by the Supreme Court of Canada, stay in your lane. This is provincial jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So one could be able to take that optimistically as applicable to something like just transition. So just transition is the name the government has given for its plan to basically stop our natural resource development the way it is now and transition it to something else. Typically that means electrification, solar, wind, that sort of stuff. If you read the judgment, one could easily apply that to something like just transition to say, you know what, they're going to have to hit brakes on here. My hunch is the environment minister said they want to go back and rewrite this and work on it quickly for that very reason. is that they still want to put in energy caps, for example, on our electricity usage here in Alberta, which Premier Smith is definitely sounding the alarm on. They even have their own website about it, Tell the Feds. They're fighting that and this just transition thing. Generally speaking, just transition, it would, from what we can tell, just based on the salaries alone, sir, it's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of salaries that are involved in energy, trucking, construction, and farming.
Yeah.
Like, it's basically how we feed ourselves and build our world is what just transition will disproportionately impact.
And there's the practical aspect of it as well, that I don't know how many, first of all, how many jobs in the computer programming world there are compared to the people we need actually growing cabbages and potatoes and beef. You know, we actually need people producing things that we can use. And if every farmer and oil rig worker is supposed to be sitting behind a desk somewhere, keying in some code or something like that, I don't think we're going to have much to eat.
No
roads to drive on, and no pipelines to get our products where we need them to go. I do have one question and concern. I mean, every judgment, there's always winners and losers, and there's good and bad about some of these court judgments. A few years ago, there was conflict in Quebec about putting a pipeline through and basically getting Alberta oil to the East Coast. And Quebec was not in favor of that. And this judgment may support Quebec in that. And so I guess, we have on the West Coast or the left coast of British Columbia, a lot of opposition to pipelines and getting oil and gas to market. And so do you see that having a negative impact on things? Like, if Alberta can have all the pipelines at once, but if they can't ship the oil east or west, like, I'm not sure why Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes would prefer to bring in conflict oil from places like the Middle East, but that seems to be what's happening now. So can you comment on that, how this could be applied, or is there a way of getting around that Quebec's and British Columbia's resistance to progress, I should say?
That's a brilliant question, and it's something that a lot of lawyers brought up immediately after. So yes, this is a huge win, and now there's more. What does this then mean? How does it apply to exactly what you point out? So Alberta doesn't have a coast. How do we get pipelines to the coast if this is going to be the ruling in the judgment? Where does federal jurisdiction cut in here? So again, this is definitely something that lawyers and experts and constitutional analysts are looking at right now.
Yeah, because I mean, I certainly hope there is a way, because oil is, oil and gas, the lifeblood of Alberta, and certainly has been a builder of Canada's economy overall. And I certainly would like to see us energy self-sufficient as a nation, and not forced to bring in conflict oil from countries that don't care about the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, we'll want to talk to you when you come up with an answer for that, how that's going to work. But it's still, we consider it a win.
Yes.
The other thing we were going to touch on today, and I'm sure there was media involvement in this case and spin from the government as to what this means and the concerns about the environment and so on. Censorship in Canada. Yes. And you and I had a chat just before we began recording about that, and maybe you can take our listeners down the trail a little way and explain what you see happening in the world of government censorship of ideas of people and organizations that don't agree with them.
So this is critically important. I haven't actually run into something this critically important that would fundamentally affect Canadians from all walks of life and political persuasions. So beginning at the beginning of this certain fight, number one, the CBC takes more than $1.2 billion from taxpayers every year. They are literally government-funded media. One. Two, media outside of the CBC is now depending upon government funding to exist. The so-called media bailout was close to $600 million. It is now being rumored that these mainstream media outlets outside of the CBC, it is rumored that these mainstream media outlets are now looking for double that amount. Okay. So as of right now, as we speak, for the journalists and media organizations that apply to the government, get approved as journalists by the government, can't believe I'm saying that, then get $14,000 per reporter. Okay.
Per reporter.
Correct.
Wow.
Roughly speaking, if one does the math, and the folks on the, I would generously say, left of center Canada Land podcast, who are totally opposed to government funding media, worked out this math. And so did some of the folks at Blacklock's Reporter, again, which gets no money from the government. It's about $14,000 per reporter. So let's look at that very quickly. That is an obvious conflict of interest. One cannot hold the government to account if one is counting on the government for a paycheck.
Exactly.
So, period. Journalists should not be paid by the government. This is the entire point of a free press. That never meant that those little old-timey newspapers on the newspaper stand in Madison Square Garden were free. No, it meant free from the government, meaning influence and money and control. So that is set. That is what we have as right now. Apart from that, we have what we're doing right now. We have I would even call it a show because people can see us. We have independent shows now, which are all brought to you using the internet. There's this show, there's Western Standard, there's Rebel, there's True North, there's all sorts of outlets that have their own shows now. And there's lots of folks on the left side of the spectrum too, that are all independent, okay? These folks don't take government money, and they're free for the choosing. However you want to get your podcast or your shows, through YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Rumble, whatever it is, people are free to choose and watch these programs. Now, what is happening is Bill C-11 has passed. We fought it tooth and nail. It is now law. While it was being debated, this is key, the federal government said repeatedly, don't worry about your shows. Don't worry about podcasts. This is all for Canadian culture. This is all so we can promote Canadian arts and culture. Nothing to see here, folks. That wasn't true, because the CRTC has now released its first two rulings. And one of those rulings is all internet platform places, so think things like YouTube and Spotify, must now register with the Trudeau government. They must now register through the CRTC. Why? Because the CRTC is going to regulate them. That includes any of these platforms that host podcasts. And those platforms, based on the letter of this decision, must now also share subscriber information. They have a tight deadline, sir, and it is deeply alarming and concerning, because two very terrible things could happen here. One, exactly what we were first worried about could happen. Under the auspices of Canadian culture, and you're not playing enough Celine Dion or giving enough maple syrup recipes, your podcast could be knocked way down.
Yeah.
So people won't be able to find it. Okay. Based on what some bureaucrat thinks is Canadian enough. Okay. Or two, which I think is much more likely, is that a big giant like Spotify or YouTube or Apple will look at Canada and say, do I really want this headache? Do I want to assign a team of my staff to deal with bureaucrats at the CRTC? And where in Canada? No, we don't. Goodbye. And then it will be lights out. And if folks are watching this thinking, oh, that's alarmist, it won't happen. Bill C-18 came from the Trudeau government too. That is why you cannot see news on Facebook anymore. Because Facebook, through its parent company Meta, said, you know what? Not worth the headache. Goodbye. The very same thing could happen like that with these podcast hosting websites. In fact, Google has come out and said, we're going to follow Meta's lead, and we're no longer very soon going to be allowing news links. So it's just, keep in mind, Google owns YouTube. So what that means for shows like this, or shows from all those other organizations I mentioned, are those qualified as news shows? I don't know. Will YouTube decide that this is the same as a news link? Who knows?
Yeah.
The issue here is none of this should be happening. And I'm sorry I took so long to lay it all out.
No,
but this vice grip of censorship is closing in on Canadians' ability to have free expression, which is why the Taxpayers Federation is involved. One, it's a massive waste of money. Two, if we can't express ourselves, we cannot hold government to account.
Yeah, well, that's a sign, foreboding throughout history when nations have shut down free expression, free speech. They're up to no good. There's never a good time when a government says, no, you can't talk about that. We've prided ourselves as Canadians, and I think Americans would say the same thing, on our freedom of speech and freedom of expression, basically freedom in general. And we've seen already over the last couple of years the government successfully twisting the narrative so that free expression has, they throw out words like hateful, hostile, homophobic, whatever, bigoted, and it doesn't always stick, but many times for those who get their news only from the mainstream media and from government sources, they're convinced, oh yeah, well, those people should not have access to the airwaves because, after all, they're giving misinformation. So that's the danger. Nazi Germany had it big time. So did Stalin in Russia, and we see it coming in Canada. So we hope that the course of this nation can be turned. And I agree with you, that is probably the most dangerous thing that's happening in our country right now.
The censors are never the good guys, ever. Yeah. And I just wanted to raise something you mentioned, their misinformation. Two things. One, if folks are thinking the CRTC, again, is just about, trying to get Bryan Adams played a little bit more often on the radio, that is not what we're talking about, okay? I worked at Sun News Network, okay, which is now no longer with us, because it was shut down by the CRTC. All of our reporters were Canadian. We covered Canadian news like crazy. We even covered local elections as if they were the Super Bowl. Our desks were made in Calgary. It didn't matter, okay? That didn't matter. When you give the government the ability to clamp down upon expression through broadcast or over the internet, which is what a lot of people use now for all of their information, you give them a very dangerous tool. And that is what we're dealing with right now. I wanted to be very clear for people who are listening to this saying, oh, well, what if you're talking about horrendous things like abusing children, God forbid, or terrorist attacks? That is not what we are talking about. Bill C-11 never dealt with that. It was all through Canadian heritage. It was all under the auspices of culture. If the government wanted to tighten rules on those terrible things I just mentioned, that would go through the Minister of Justice. Mm-hmm. Okay? This has nothing to do with that. And further to your point about misinformation, The government uses that term a lot. They use the term misinformation and disinformation a lot, even about non-culture issues. So something as innocuous and straight math as the carbon tax, okay? And the fact that the carbon tax, on average, costs people much more than they get back in a rebate, the government has called that misinformation coming from us.
Wow.
We're an organization that's been around more than 30 years. We started before the internet. If they bring back their Online Harms Act, that law, and they start outlawing misinformation and work it in under these same rules, we're in some trouble, folks. And again, I would appeal to all of the folks who call themselves Liberal, NDP, Green Party. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Wait until the next guy is in. Are you comfortable with him or her deciding what you can see and share on the internet? You should not be.
Yeah, absolutely. Kris Sims, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Alberta Director. What else would you like our listeners to know before we close off for today?
Just that this is very critical. This issue of things like C11, C18, the media now being on the payroll of the government, asking for more payroll coming from the government, the CBC now reaching into the C18 link tax to get their lion's share of money from that also, combined with all of these risks of clamping down through the CRTC on independent media. A friend of mine once said, and he might have been paraphrasing somebody, but he once said, if you take away all my rights, leave me my freedom of speech, because with it, I can win all the rest of them back.
Right.
And that, again, has to apply to all Canadians. We don't care if you're part of the policy alternatives group and you want electric cars for everybody and to live in government-owned pods. That's fine. You should be allowed to say so. You should be allowed to gather. You should be allowed to door knock about that and elect politicians as you see fit. You should be allowed to have shows and podcasts promoting that idea like crazy. We might disagree with you. That's okay. That's the point of free expression. This legislation, all of these laws combined, like a big octopus with its tentacles out, puts all of that at risk. And so I would appeal to all of your viewers and listeners, tell 10 friends about this. Not just those who might watch this show regularly. Reach out to your lefty auntie who you love and that you're going to be meeting with for Christmas. Tell them about the risk to free expression and then contact your member of parliament.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You've done a great job of highlighting this very critical issue. We've spoken about it in the past. We've written about it, but you can't say too much about this because there will come a time if we don't speak now, we're not going to be able to speak later. So
that's correct.
They say at the marriage ceremonies, speak now or forever hold your peace. And we also say free speech, use it or lose it. So on that note, we'll end with encouraging our members to do just that. Folks, visit taxpayer.com, get subscribed to the Taxpayer magazine, and follow these folks on their podcast because they are doing a great service for Canadians. And Kris, we thank you for what you're doing and keep up your good work.
Thank you.